Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Well, I did say I wanted to do more horror, I suppose. I thought since it has been a while that it would be good to jump into back into a documentary film. And as I've mentioned, I think with previous documentaries, I do have an interest. One of my interests being that of true crime. And I was aware that a documentary had been made about Dennis Nilsen. Of course, this coming only a few months after the David Tennant starring TV series Des, where he plays the titular Dennis Nilsen. And of course, the nature of this documentary is, of course, almost as though it is being presented by Nielsen himself. Because, of course, the way that Memoirs of a Murder works is that it's almost framed using, or almost it is framed using the recordings of Dennis Nilsen that he had made throughout his time in prison. And so he introduces the film to some degree, even though, of course, having long since passed, it's very much used as a sort of device to, I suppose, guide us through until we can get to the actual facts of the crime. And at the same time, getting this haunting, almost, disturbing account of Nielsen's own thought processes, and the fact that one of the most famous aspects of Dennis Nilsen is the fact that he is unremarkable to some degree. Throughout the documentary, of course, which, as well as Dennis Nilsen's recordings, is accounts of the police officers who investigated and arrested him, the journalists who covered the sort of escalating media storm around him, the survivors amongst the people he tried to kill, and the families of those who he did kill. And the common, I suppose, aspect of it is the fact that he is presented as such an unimposing presence when you get partway through the documentary, once the arrest has happened. Because the investigation itself is not the interesting factor. The police officers who arrest him themselves say how, with a lot of these sorts of serial killer crimes, it becomes a case of finding the bodies, what links the bodies, to then unravel who the murderer is. Whereas here, they have the murderer. Like, he gives himself up almost immediately, and it's just then a case of finding out exactly how many people he's killed and who those people are. But once you sort of get through that and you get to the point where he is on trial, the journalists, when they bring him out and they're leading him into the courtroom, journalists say that, they were anticipating this some kind of hulking, menacing, Michael Myers-like figure, whereas Dennis Nilsen is unassuming. He doesn't look particularly extraordinary. He looks like just some middle-aged man. And so, of course, you have that strange dichotomy of the brutality and horror of his crimes set against someone who could be, frankly, anyone. And of course, then on top of that, you have these recordings where you have him just musing about the fact that he did committed these horrific acts, and he's very he is unapologetic about it, but on top of that, he's also he admits to to everything. He's not particularly repressant about it. He's not, he's very willing to just talk through the crimes, the victims, and the only problem that the police have, and as is portrayed in the recordings, is that it's his failing of memory. That fact that he just doesn't quite remember where he's buried people, or who they were. He's forgotten names, and of course that could all be an act. It could all have been an act to play with the police, but other than that, the fact that he was incredibly cooperative and willing to talk about it, because he saw himself as, I suppose, a figure, a character, something important. And of course that's where the tapes come into play, because they are ultimately him trying to present an account of himself where he is this grand figure that, and again, it's disputed exactly what, but whether it was, he wanted to sort of perceive himself as a Hannibal Lecter-like character, or whether he saw himself as just some tragic, a tragic figure who is not responsible for his actions. It's difficult, because ultimately it comes down to ego, and the fact is that wanting to write his own autobiography, as later he then states, you get that sense of someone who has a huge sense of self-importance and wants to be perceived as this great part of British history, even though the part that he will contribute is a narrative of horror, and yet at the same time, therefore he sees himself as having a great story to tell. And of course you have that strange thing where we as a society, and as people, as inquisitive people individually, want to see meaning behind it. A lot of the sort of Ed Gein type characters, you can get a sense of, well, this happened and this happened, and these could have been the triggers. A lot of serial killers seem to have genuinely had some kind of frontal lobe injury, but there's at least a sense of traceability, even if it's tenuous, even if it's, oh, I was slighted by an ex-wife, or I had to repress my sexuality. You get that sense of meaning behind it. And of course, I suppose the repression is the source of Dennis Nilsen's, also the supposed source of Dennis Nilsen's, the nature of his crimes. Of course, the repression shouldn't be the sole contributing factor, but with so little to go on, there is that desire to understand, okay, why did he commit? Why did he not only commit the crimes, but did he do such horrifying things with the bodies? And the fact that, he was burying them in his own flat. And you think, there was this sense of, well, he knew this was going to end, that eventually he would get caught. That, of course, what happened was an inevitability, which was that eventually the bodies began to fill up the drain, or the chunks of bodies were beginning to fill up the drains, and of course that eventually led, with the complaints from other tenants, that led the police to him. And again, you just get that sense of questioning, in such an ordinary setting, you question how and why would, how could this exist right in front of us? It's one thing to have a, middle of nowhere killer, or someone who travels across the country, but the fact that he didn't really hide the fact, and he was, again, the fact that he was, went from police officer to civil servant, there was nothing particularly amongst his journey that makes you think, oh, this is the trigger. But again, it's difficult. It's difficult to understand, and I think part of the documentary is trying to give you that sense of, oh, maybe from his own account you can possibly get a deeper understanding of him, but frankly, you can't. And I think that's, on a meta-textual level, I think the documentary filmmaker is trying to get across that, because yes, there is something of the macabre, and there is a question of morality about whether we should, or ethics about whether we, whether a filmmaker should be using a serial killer's own self portrayal as part of their narrative. Some people have even argued that serial killers shouldn't be allowed to be given a voice. So many of them write novels or memoirs, or and make recordings like this, take interviews, and although they can't profit of it based, from sort of based on the law, you again get that sense of it. The profitability isn't really the thing, but it's the fact that it means they get to control their narrative to some degree. But at the same time, it would be a shame not to have this, because it is such a unique perspective. And I think the filmmaker, as you observe the documentary, does portray that conflict, particularly as we get to the interviews with the victim, well, the survivors and the families of the victims. You get that conflict of like I say, portraying an ethically difficult narrative, because we're giving voice to someone who took voice away from so many others. And then, of course, there is the societal sort of question about it. The fact that, like with so many serial killers, often they aren't caught because they choose, or the victims that they have they prey upon are often, depending on what time period, and are often sort of people who are ignored by the authorities. So in Nielsen's case, of course, it meant many of the homeless or gay community, those being sort of a Venn diagram, of course, because not everyone who Nielsen killed was homeless and completely detached from family and friends, and not everyone Nielsen killed was gay, but a mixture of the both. He very much preyed upon two different swathes of society, again, both vulnerable and both ignored by the authorities, and it again brings into question the sort of the policing aspect of it. I suppose I am reluctant to say, but timing being what it is, it feels ignorant to not mention the fact that, of course, watching this documentary aligns almost perfectly with the trial and sentencing of the murder of Sarah Everett, who, of course, was detained, assaulted, and murdered by a police officer. And it then, of course, brings up the question of police, the relationship with police, and well, in Sarah Everett's case, women, and the way that vulnerability can be exploited by a dangerous police officer. The other factor about Nielsen is the fact that he was a former police officer and was on the cusp of one of the crimes he commits, as an account of one of his fellow serving officers. The fact that he almost started committing crimes even whilst serving, and you get that sense of someone who should never have been allowed any kind of authority even back then, but these things are cyclical, and it brings into question sort of monitoring and self-policing, I suppose, for lack of a better term, the idea, or societal policing, and the idea that we should bring into sharp focus what what standards we should be holding our the people who are supposed to protect us to. But yeah, it is an interesting documentary, and despite the sort of ethical conundrum of it, this is a unique perspective, because there aren't many serial killers who you get to actually hear from their own perspective how they saw themselves. but it is difficult. It is difficult because, as I say, it brings into sort of question the nature of portrayal and narrative control. And as I say, the documentary filmmaker even ends the documentary by trying to take back the narrative from Nielsen to some degree, and again give voice to those who, you know, who either were victims of or those who's lost their family because of him. And it gives it an interesting perspective, and especially considering it wasn't that long ago, you know, I mean, well, before my lifetime, but still, it wasn't so long ago that this is like a historical crime. This still feels relevant, and I think therefore the themes and ideas within the documentary are very interesting. And yeah, as a film, it is, you know, as a documentary film, the filmmaking, as I say, uses an interesting mechanism between the recordings, news footage, the talking heads of all these different contributing factors. It possibly isn't the most remarkable film, just simply in terms of cinematography and sort of filmmaking style, just because it's trying to be fairly stripped down and very straightforward in its presentation. But still, it is, like I say, the mechanisms within it are interesting, if not unique. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below and share the video, because those all help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.